There's a version of this you've told yourself 100 times. That you just have bad luck with people. That you keep attracting the wrong ones. The narcissist, the emotionally unavailable, the one who needed too much, the one who gave too little. You've analyzed the relationships. You've talked about them. You've sworn, more than once, that you'd never end up in something like that again. And then you did. Not with the same person, with a different face, a different name, a different set of reasons why it made sense this time, but the same dynamic, the same exhaustion, the same slow erosion of something you can't quite name but recognize as yourself. The question isn't why these relationships hurt you. The question is why you keep building them. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the invisible architecture of human psychology. Not the surface behaviors, not the conscious choices people think they're making, but the deeper mechanisms running underneath. What he found wasn't flattering. He found that most people don't choose their relationships at all. Not really. They're pulled into them. By projections, by unresolved needs, by psychological patterns so deeply embedded they feel like personality, like preference, like love. Jung identified 4 specific types of relationships that destroy people. Not violently, not suddenly, but silently, over years, through dynamics so familiar they're almost invisible. And the reason they're so difficult to detect is precisely that they don't feel destructive in the beginning. They feel like connection. They feel like finally being understood. They feel, sometimes, like the most alive you've ever been. That feeling is a mechanism, and it's working exactly as designed. What Jung understood, and what most psychology refuses to say plainly, is that the patterns you repeat in relationships aren't random. They're symptoms. They point to something unfinished inside you, something unbuilt, something you've been trying to complete through other people instead of through yourself. The process he called individuation, the development of a genuine, differentiated self, is precisely what these 4 types of relationships prevent. Not by accident, by design. You are not a victim of circumstance, you are a participant in a pattern. And the difference between those 2 positions is everything. What follows isn't a guide to identifying toxic people. It's something harder. A map of the specific ways your own psyche conspires against you. And 4 precise points where that conspiracy becomes destruction. Not the kind you can see from the outside. The kind that takes years. The kind where you wake up one day and realize you don't recognize who you've become. That's where we begin. You don't fall in love with people. You fall in love with what you need them to be. This isn't cynicism. It's Jung's most precise and devastating observation about human attachment, that when a person has not developed certain aspects of themselves internally, their potential, their emotional range, their sense of wholeness, the psyche does not simply leave those aspects dormant. It projects them outward. It finds a face, attaches everything to that face, and calls it love. Jung named the internal image at the center of this mechanism the anima in men and the animus in women. These are not metaphors. They are structural features of the psyche, inherited templates shaped by every ancestor who ever loved or feared or needed someone of the opposite nature. They live in the unconscious, fully formed, waiting. And when the right person walks into the room and resembles that image closely enough, the projection fires, instantly, completely, with a force that feels like fate. That force is not fate. It is unfinished business with yourself. The signs of this type are unmistakable once you know what you're looking at. The idealization is disproportionate. The person seems not just attractive but singular, irreplaceable, as though the universe arranged itself to produce them. Your mood, your sense of purpose, your very identity begins to orbit theirs. You don't want to spend time with them. You need to. Hobbies disappear, friendships thin. The life you had before starts to feel like a waiting room you were sitting in until they arrived. And then reality intervenes. It always does. The person reveals an ordinary flaw, a bad day, a contradiction, a moment of smallness, and something in you collapses, not because they have failed you, but because the projection cannot survive contact with an actual human being. What you loved was never them. It was the image of your own unrealized self, cast onto them like a film projected onto a wall. Remove the screen, and the image disappears. Jung was precise about what this costs. Every year spent projecting is a year not spent developing. Every quality you idealized in another person was a quality you were capable of building in yourself, and didn't. The projection is not just painful when it ends. It is a form of psychological debt, accrued silently, that must eventually be paid. The exit from this type is not finding someone less idealized. It is asking the harder question: what specifically did you see in them that devastated you with recognition? What did they represent that you have not become? Because those qualities, the ones that felt like they completed you, are not theirs. They were always yours. They are the outline of the self you have not yet had the courage to build. That work begins the moment you stop looking for someone to carry it for you. And in the next part, we'll examine what happens when the problem isn't projection, but the complete dissolution of the boundary between you and another person entirely. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Most people mistake fusion for intimacy. They are opposites. Intimacy requires two distinct selves choosing to connect. Fusion is what happens when there are no selves distinct enough to make that choice. It is not closeness. It is the collapse of the distance that makes closeness possible. And Jung understood it not as a failure of the relationship, but as a failure of development. Two adults who never fully separated from the psychological condition of childhood, replicating that condition in each other. The technical term Jung used, borrowed from the anthropologist Levi Bruhl, was participation mystique, a state of unconscious identity with another, where the boundaries of the self dissolve into the surrounding field. In infants, this is normal. The child and the mother exist as a single psychological unit before the ego is strong enough to differentiate. What Jung observed, with clinical precision, is that a significant number of adults never complete that differentiation. They carry the unresolved need for merger into every relationship they form, and they find partners who carry the same wound. What this looks like from the inside feels nothing like pathology. It feels like finally being known. You feel each other's moods before words are spoken. You make no decision without the other. Disagreement produces guilt so acute it functions as pain. Because divergence feels like betrayal, and separateness feels like abandonment. The relationship becomes a sealed system. Friends thin out, family recedes, outside influences are unconsciously treated as threats to the unity. Your identity is no longer I, it is we. And you have no clear sense of where you end and the other person begins. Jung was unambiguous about what this costs. Fusion does not deepen the self, it suspends it. The psychological growth that requires friction, solitude, differentiated experience, all of it stops. You cannot individuate while merged. You cannot develop strength you never have to use alone. The fused person does not become more whole through the relationship. They become more dependent, more anxious at the prospect of separation, more convinced that they cannot function as a separate entity, because gradually they cannot. The moment of rupture is always the same. The relationship ends or falters or demands renegotiation, and the person discovers they have no self to return to, not because the other person took it, because they surrendered it, slowly, in exchange for the feeling of being complete. The exit from this type is not the end of closeness. It is the construction of genuine separateness. Learning to hold an opinion that differs, to spend time alone without panic, to make a decision without needing it ratified. These are not acts of coldness. They are acts of psychological courage. The anxiety that arises when you begin to differentiate is not a signal that something is wrong. It is evidence that something is finally happening. Two whole people choosing to connect is not fusion. It is something rarer and something better. But first, each of them has to exist. What comes next is different in texture, but identical in consequence. A type of relationship where the destruction isn't about losing yourself in someone. It's about being slowly emptied by them. You don't notice it at first because it doesn't feel like depletion. It feels like being needed. And being needed, for many people, is close enough to being loved that the difference takes years to surface. By the time it does, the damage is already structural. You are not tired from a bad week. You are tired in a way that has become your baseline, a chronic flatness, a diminished appetite for your own life, a sense that your energy exists primarily to be consumed by someone else. This is what Jung identified as psychic vampirism, not a dramatic predation, but a quiet, continuous extraction. And understanding why it happens requires understanding something Jung observed about the structure of the self, that a person who has not developed a stable internal source of psychic energy, whose self is fragmented, whose ego foundation is weak, cannot generate what they need from within, so they draw it from outside, from proximity, from attention, from the particular kind of care that never quite satisfies and therefore never quite ends. The dynamic has a recognizable shape. Conversations orbit their needs with a gravitational pull that leaves no room for yours. When you try to introduce your own difficulty, the subject shifts, not always deliberately, but consistently. Crises arrive in an unbroken succession, each one urgent enough to require your full presence, your full resource, your full suspension of whatever was happening in your own life. And when you give that, when you show up again and manage the emergency again, there is no real relief. The crisis resolves into the next crisis. The gratitude is thin and brief. The cycle resets. What makes this type so difficult to name is that it is wrapped in the language of closeness. You are told, implicitly or explicitly, that your availability is love, that your limits are abandonment, that your exhaustion is selfishness. And if you already carry the belief that your worth is measured by how much you can give, that being needed is the closest thing you have to being valued, then this language lands. It sticks. It keeps you in position. Jung understood that the person doing the draining is not, in most cases, calculating. They are operating from genuine deficiency. The self that cannot sustain itself is not a fiction. It is a clinical reality, a psychological structure that developed under specific conditions and now perpetuates itself through extraction. Knowing this does not make the relationship sustainable. It makes it explicable. And explanation here is not absolution. The signal Jung would point you toward is not the behavior in the worst moments. It is how you feel in the ordinary ones. After a typical conversation, a typical evening, a typical week, not after a crisis, but after the baseline. Are you more alive or less? That answer, held honestly, tells you everything. Setting a limit with this type does not produce reflection. It produces escalation. The drama intensifies, the need amplifies, the pressure mounts until the limit breaks. If you find that your boundaries consistently collapse under that pressure, it is not because you are weak. It is because the relationship has been structured over time to make your depletion feel like devotion. The only exit is complete, not reduced contact, not renegotiated terms, out, because the mechanism does not change while you remain available to it. What comes next is different in one crucial way. The fourth type doesn't drain you through neediness alone. It traps you through your own compulsion to care, and turns that compulsion into a life you never agreed to live. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from being drained, but from carrying weight that was never yours to carry. You recognize it in the way you move through the relationship, always managing, always anticipating, always one step ahead of a collapse that you have learned, through long experience, to prevent. You handle the finances they can't organize. You regulate the emotions they can't contain. You absorb the consequences of choices they refuse to take responsibility for. And somewhere along the way, without a formal agreement, without a conscious decision, you became the adult in a relationship between two adults. Jung called this the failure of individuation, and he was precise about what that failure produces. When a person reaches adulthood chronologically but not psychologically, they do not simply remain incomplete. They seek a completion outside themselves. They find someone willing to carry the parental function, someone who will provide the containment, the regulation, the emotional infrastructure that their own development never built. And if you are that person, the relationship will feel, in its early stages, like depth, like being irreplaceable, like love. What it actually is a role, and roles, unlike relationships, do not grow. The signs accumulate slowly enough that each one feels manageable in isolation. They collapse over things that seem minor, and you learn to calibrate your behavior to prevent those collapses, which means you are now managing not just your own emotional life, but theirs. When you fail to manage it perfectly, there is punishment, withdrawal, sulking, the particular cruelty of someone who has learned that emotional regression produces results. You feel responsible for their happiness in a way that has no logical basis, and guilty for their failures as though they were yours. Jung understood exactly where this pattern originates. In The Development of Personality, he observed that what parents fail to live, the unlived life, the avoided confrontation, the unresolved psychological task, gets transferred to the next generation, not through conversation, but through the invisible pressure of the unconscious. The child who grew up managing a parent's emotions, stabilizing a parent's moods, becoming the emotional anchor of a household that needed one. That child becomes an adult who does it automatically. Not because they choose to, because it is the only map of love they were ever given. The relationship then is not a coincidence, it is a repetition. The emotionally immature partner did not arrive randomly. They fit a psychological groove worn so deep it feels like preference, like a type you're simply attracted to. Jung would say, you are not attracted to them. You are attracted to the familiarity of the function, and the function will cost you everything if you let it run long enough. Not dramatically, quietly, in the years that pass while you are living someone else's life. In the ambitions deferred, the needs unvoiced, the version of yourself that never had enough space to exist because the relationship consumed the space required to become it. The exit here requires something most people find almost unbearable: deliberate withdrawal of care. Not cruelty, precision, allowing the other person to face the consequences of their own choices without interception. This is the only condition under which real growth becomes possible for them. And it is the only condition under which you get your life back. But stopping the behavior is only half the work. The other half is understanding why you started. Because the 4 types we've examined don't appear randomly in a life. They form a pattern, and patterns have a source, one that lives much closer than any of the people you've blamed. The most uncomfortable thing Jung ever said about repetition is also the most precise. You do not repeat what was done to you. You repeat what you never finished processing. This is the distinction that changes everything. Because most people, when they recognize a pattern in their relationships, locate the problem in the external world. The narcissists keep finding them. The emotionally unavailable keep appearing. The ones who need saving keep showing up. And so the solution, logically, is better selection, more careful vetting, stricter criteria, a more deliberate screening of who gets close. But the pattern doesn't live in the people you choose. It lives in the choosing itself. Jung was unambiguous about this in Marriage as a Psychological Relationship. The greater the area of unconsciousness a person carries, he wrote, the less their relational choices are actually choices at all. They are compulsions dressed as preferences. They feel like attraction, like recognition, like chemistry. But they are the psyche executing an old program, searching for the conditions it knows, because the unknown, however better, has no emotional grammar yet. What the unconscious is searching for is not happiness, it is completion. And completion, in the psychic economy Jung described, means finishing what was interrupted. The child who learned to earn love through caretaking will be drawn, without knowing it, to people who need to be cared for. Not because they haven't learned better, but because care is the only relational language that feels fluent. The person who learned that love is volatile will find stability not just boring, but faintly unreal, a performance of something that couldn't possibly be genuine. The person who never developed their own interior life will keep projecting it outward, onto one face after another, until the projection is finally recognized for what it is. This is not destiny. It is unprocessed material exerting gravitational force. Jung's concept of individuation is, at its core, the antidote to this. It is the process by which the unconscious becomes conscious, by which the patterns that run you are brought into the light, where they can be examined, and where you can finally exercise something that resembles actual choice. But individuation is not a therapy technique or a self-improvement protocol. It is a confrontation. With the parts of yourself you projected onto others, with the needs you disguised as love, with the wounds you mistook for personality. Most people never begin it. Not because they lack intelligence or willingness, but because the unconscious is not passive. It resists examination. It produces exactly enough discomfort to keep you moving toward familiar pain and away from unfamiliar growth. The 4 types of relationships we've examined are not traps set by other people. They are the unconscious rendering itself visible in the only language it speaks, in what you keep choosing, what you keep tolerating, what you keep calling love, even when it costs you yourself. Recognizing the pattern is not the same as breaking it, but it is the only thing that makes breaking it possible, because you cannot interrupt what you cannot see. And most people spend their entire lives in relationships that are, at bottom, arguments with their own unfinished development, arguments conducted through other people at enormous cost and never quite resolved. The question that remains is the hardest one, not what to stop doing, but what it actually means to begin. Jung never promised that individuation would make you happy. He promised it would make you real. That distinction matters more than most people are willing to sit with. Because what you have been calling love, in at least some of its forms, across at least some of your relationships, has not been an encounter between 2 real people. It has been a negotiation between 2 sets of unfinished business, a projection meeting a wound, a need for containment meeting a compulsion to provide it, a depleted self meeting someone willing to be depleted. These are not relationships in the fullest sense. They are psychological transactions conducted in the language of intimacy, at the price of the self. The hardest truth in everything Jung wrote about relationships is this: you cannot give what you have not built. You cannot love a real person while you are still in love with a projection. You cannot connect from a self that has been fused into someone else. You cannot offer genuine care from a position of chronic depletion. You cannot be a partner to an adult while you are still operating as their parent. These are not moral failures. They are structural ones, and structure can be changed, but only by confronting what built it. Individuation is that confrontation. It is the slow, unglamorous process of withdrawing your projections and developing what you projected, of differentiating yourself from others without losing the capacity for genuine connection, of building an interior life substantial enough that you no longer need to extract from others what you have not cultivated in yourself. It is not a destination, it is a direction, and it begins not with a new relationship, but with an honest accounting of the ones that have already cost you the most. Look at the 4 types, not as categories of people to avoid. That is the wrong reading, and it will produce the wrong result. Look at them as mirrors. The person you idealized beyond reason is showing you something you have not become. The relationship where you lost all boundaries is showing you how little self you had constructed before you entered it. The one who drained you is showing you what you believed you had to give in order to deserve presence. The one you parented is showing you the groove that was worn into you long before they arrived. These are not comfortable things to see. Jung did not design individuation to be comfortable. He designed it to be true. Here is what you can do right now that is not a checklist and not a strategy. Take one relationship, current or past, that fits one of these 4 types, and ask a single question. Not what they did wrong. Not what you should have done differently. Ask, what did I believe about myself that made this feel like the only option? Sit with that question without rushing to answer it. The answer, when it comes, will not be flattering. It will also be the first genuinely free thing you have done in that relationship. That is where it begins. Not with better choices, but with a self capable of making them. If something in this video landed in a way you weren't expecting, leave it in the comments. Not what you think, what you recognized. The distinction matters. The work that starts here doesn't end here. There is more in the unconscious than 4 relationship types. There is an entire architecture of patterns, defenses, and unlived life waiting to be examined. What you do with that is up to you. But you've already started. You wouldn't still be watching if you hadn't.